All right, so let's go ahead and, I'm gonna introduce our next speaker, Liz Graham. Liz, I know she wanted to, come over here to Sitka. She's disappointed she wasn't able to make it over. We're glad to have her remotely via through the wires here. So Liz Graham, Elizabeth is a PhD entomologist for the Region 10 Health Protection. Liz joined the Forest Service in 2012 and has served as the entomologist in Southeast Alaska ever since. Her focus is on monitoring forest pests and their impacts on the forest. Prior to coming to Alaska, she worked with Michigan State University and the Northern Research Station in East Lansing, Michigan, studying chemical communication and wood-borne beetles and a way to monitor the forest. And I'll just also chip in, and usually when she's here in person, or in Juneau, she's one of the best homemade ice cream makers around. Here's another trait that we appreciate Liz for. So Liz, it's all yours.
Thanks, Pat. And I actually am currently working on some ice cream sandwiches for our Forest Health meeting in Anchorage next week. So not to tease you all with that. Sorry, I'm not there in person. It's been it's a bummer, but I've been enjoying being able to attend remotely. Can you all see my screen okay?
Looks good,
yep.
Liz.
Awesome. Well, and thanks, Damian. You had a nice precursor talk there and set me up well to talk about this major defoliation event we've been experiencing here in Southeast. I'll say for the first half of my career here in Juneau, as an entomologist, it was maybe a little bit boring because we are pretty lucky in having this amazing healthy forest with very little insect activity and outbreaks. But then that all changed a few years ago, and it's been pretty nonstop and fun and exciting ever since. So let's see. All right. So yeah, we've, as I mentioned, and Damian mentioned in his talk, we've been experiencing this major defoliation event here in Southeast. And so some of this you hopefully you're all already familiar about, but my plan here today is just to kind of take us through the progression of these outbreaks, and then where things are at, and then where we're headed. So basically a defoliation event is a major insect outbreak. We're not talking a few trees that got stripped by tussock moth or something like that. We're talking whole hillsides and landscapes that are heavily defoliated. And this will occur when the insect populations rise to levels beyond their natural controls, keeping them in check. In some cases, they're cyclical, where they tend to happen on like a every 30-year basis, but it can also be something that's triggered by environmental conditions. And so here in Southeast, we have two defoliators who are responsible for stripping the needles off hemlock. And these are the two big ones. They're both endemic to the forest. They're a natural part of the ecosystem. They're here all the time, just typically they're in small levels, so we don't tend to notice them. But the two species we have here on the left is the hemlock sawfly. That's the larva there. It grows up to be a sawfly, which is kind of like a stingless wasp. And then the western black-headed budworm is who we have hanging here on the right. And that is a caterpillar and grows up to be a pretty brown drab moth. What's interesting about these two species is that they're actually separated through different ecological niches, even though they're on the same hosts. The hemlock sawfly prefer to feed on the older needles of the trees. It's the newer needles aren't actually nutritionally adequate for them. And then the reverse goes for western black-headed budworm. As the name budworm indicates, they actually start feeding on the buds, and then they're synchronized to have their eggs hatch right as the buds are emerging. And so they'll feed in those buds, mine them, and then as the shoots elongate, start feeding on that new growth. And so that the hemlock sawfly pretty much exclusively feeds in in hemlock. They will occasionally go on to some spruce if they run out of other stuff to eat. Whereas Western black-headed budworm prefers hemlock first, but then when they get hungry and desperate, they will move on into the spruce without a problem. So that damage, having those two different patterns, that's actually something that our aerial surveyors can distinguish from the air as well. Because the sawfly are feeding on the older needles, it tends to give the tree more of a yellowish appearance where it still has the green on the tips, but the inside's a little bit more hollow. And then the budworms, they tend to create what can be quite alarming looking in that the trees turn red. The tips are all, a lot of times the needles are half fed on and then they turn red. And it for a lot of people who aren't used to these kind of defoliation events, the first thing that often comes to mind is something like spruce beetle. And of course, when you have a tree that's killed by spruce beetle, it's not going to come back. Whereas if you have a tree that's been defoliated by budworm, it still has a good chance of survival. So the outbreak essentially kicked off with hemlock sawfly in 2018. And we actually found out about this through a member of the public who had stopped in my office and was concerned about the state of trees in their cabin on Killisnoo Island, right across from Angoon on Admiralty Island. And she was worried. We thought, you know, that, oh, we just finished our aerial survey. We haven't seen much going on. And then she planted a bag of frass on my desk. And that was a nice fancy way of saying insect poop. And so realized right away that we actually had kind of missed this outbreak that was starting. So we were able to scramble and do some aerial surveys that year. And we mapped tens of thousands of acres. I think it was about 50,000 acres that first year, but we were limited in our surveying. A lot of it was around Admiralty, which is where it was heaviest. But then in 2019, thanks to that info from the public, we were able to, we were prepared and we had a much more thorough survey. We timed it a little bit later, and we were able to get out on the ground as well. And there we found hemlock sawfly was the reigning pest throughout the forest. It was some areas trees were really heavily stripped. We recorded 380,000 acres of defoliation across Southeast. And for the most part, it was all sawfly. Occasionally we would see a budworm here or there, but it was almost all sawfly. And what's interesting about hemlock sawflies, they like to feed in these aggregates. So they feed in these large groups. They actually use a trail pheromone. So once they emerge from the needles or from their eggs, they then kind of group up. And so when you get a tree that's infested, it might just get super heavily infested. Whereas you could have one next door that's kind of untouched. 2020, we did not do our aerial surveys due to COVID. We relied on a lot of comments from the people in the districts and observations from the field that way. We also did some doing some surveys through imagery, satellite imagery. But what we pretty much found throughout the region was that the sawfly population had crashed. And what I forgot to mention, in 2018 and 2019, you all may recall that we had an extended drought. We were in an extreme drought in Southeast. And that was probably what triggered this hemlock sawfly outbreak, because their populations are limited by a fungus that is usually what keeps that population from getting too big. But when you have a drought, you know, like most fungi, they don't grow that well. So the fungus didn't spread and wasn't able to keep up, and that led to the sawfly outbreak. So that crashed in 2020. 2020 was a miserable summer, I recall, for many reasons. And we saw very little sawfly activity, but then we started to get a few reports about the budworm population rising. And I mentioned earlier, the budworms love to do what I call hangling, where they'll drop from a silk thread from the tree and they'll hang from the branches, and they either swing to a new one. And for people who are around during this, it could be quite obnoxious having these in your face as you're walking through the woods. but 2021 is when things really took off. The budworm outbreak really exploded that year. And as I mentioned earlier, the trees turning red, that's when things really were taken notice by the public. There was a lot of people reporting and a lot of people concerned about the red trees. And so we tried really hard to put as much information out as we could. We worked with the public affairs team to make some videos and just things like that, and trying to explain the role the defoliators have in the forest. And sometimes I feel like I'm trying to defend the insects and plead their case, and but I also recognize that it's pretty worrisome for people. So in 2021, we recorded defoliation from Western black-headed budworm across over 500,000 acres. But more importantly, we were recording mortality that we were tying to the hemlock sawfly outbreak, and then possibly the combination of budworm on top of it. And so in 2021, we had about 21,000 acres of mortality that we recorded. But then we also had a lot of top kill that was recorded. The budworms like to start in the tops of the trees. And so that's where you tend to get a lot of the damage, is up in that upper crown. And historically, when we've had these outbreaks, that's the main thing that will be reported as the top kill. And in many cases, the trees will recover, but it also will lead to broken tops and those things that help to create the dynamics of the old growth forest. But then 2022 came, and we had the change to Sitka spruce. They really were hammering those hemlock in 2021. But in 2022, they started feeding on Sitka spruce as well. And what was nice, though, for the spruce is they were not impacted by hemlock sawfly. So the spruce were doing great. They had all their old needles. They had pretty full crowns. So even though they were all bright red and looking scary, they actually were holding on really well. So I'm not too worried about spruce. And when I talk about mortality moving forward, it's pretty much exclusively in hemlock that we've seen. I don't think I've ever actually seen a spruce that I would say was killed by budworm or sawfly. It's pretty much all Western hemlock. So in 2022, we recorded the highest amount of defoliation, and this was 685,000 acres, as well as quite a bit of mortality. And so when we talk about mortality that was recorded, it was recorded at different amounts. So there's very light, which is only a few trees affected. That's almost just background noise. Light, 4 to 10% of the trees within the acres affected. Moderate, 11 to 29, and then severe, 30 to 50. And so this photo that I have here on the right, there's some young trees on the lower part of the slope there, and those all have active budworm feeding. But then there's some, if you look at the stand above it, there's some mortality where, and top kill as well. It might initially look like there's a heavy amount of mortality, but then as you kind of follow the tree line down, you can see that a lot of these trees here on the edge all still have their lower crowns, but they're missing, the tops are probably not going to recover. So something like this, we would maybe rate it as a moderate level of mortality, that there is some recently killed trees in there. But for the most part, I think it's mostly top kill. So in 2022, we recorded 73,000 acres of hemlock mortality. Again, most of this was in that light to very light category. Even though some people, if it's in where their favorite fishing spot is, or they have a cabin there, they might not feel comforted when I say it's only a light amount or a moderate amount of mortality. It still can be pretty concerning. So we've been trying to at least get some more information out about where the worse the damage is, and what resources people can use. And I'll get to that in a minute here. But this is all based on our aerial detection surveys. So as you can see, the worst of it is all along Western Admiralty, where we first heard about the hemlock sawfly outbreak. That's where some of the heaviest and most concentrated amount of mortality we saw was. I was just in Angoon on Monday and flying in there. It's still just kind of shocking to see the amount of top kill and dead trees right in that western side. And then the other area is in the central Tongass. And historically, this is where we've had the most impacts from these outbreaks in the past. So that's pretty typical for what's happened in previously known big outbreaks like this. So just kind of zooming in on those areas, Warrenofsky Island off of Wrangell, that had some heavy patches in there. Wrangell Island has some dense patches. And then again, that Western Admiralty, that was probably one of the worst, heaviest, most concentrated areas. So this last year, I might be starting to catch my breath. The defoliation was only recorded during our aerial surveys on 63,000 acres. So almost a 10-fold decrease from what we saw last year. So whew, nice break. We've been doing our ground surveys every year, and we are still finding some caterpillars while we're out there, but the damage is pretty light. The interesting thing is now we're seeing in 2023, we saw more active defoliation further north. So we did still see some here in the Juneau area, and then heading on up into Haines. That was probably where the most amount of defoliation was recorded this year. And we also did still record some mortality associated with this event, almost 30,000 acres. So this is what it looked like. Here in 2023, in orange, we have the current defoliation, again, mostly just going up the Lynn Canal there and around the Haines area and Juneau. And then just spots of mortality, again, along Western Admiralty, over here on Baranoff and Chichikov on those the sides, and then still a little bit more down in the Wrangell area. But again, this is most of it is in the very light category, and I imagine as we're moving forward, we'll start mapping less and less of this. So the question I always get is, how does it end? Is it over? Is it ending? And the nice thing about having an outbreak by a natural pest like this is that it usually comes with its own checks and balances. And so the main things that cause these outbreaks to end are going to be disease, parasitism, predation, and ultimately starvation. I mean, they can eat themselves literally out of house and home. So here on the right side, we have a couple black-headed budworms that have, one is a viral disease, and on the bottom is a fungal disease. And then on the bottom, the coolest, is we have these parasitic wasps that it takes a minute for their population to catch up, but when they do, they get really good. Hopefully you can see this video. He's piercing the pupa there and laying her eggs inside of the pupal case, and then eventually the wasp will develop inside the pupa and burst out and go find a new one to infest and kill. So really, these populations go through what we call a boom and a bust. And so from 2020 to 2023, we were in the boom, and now we should be fully in the bust. And so I'm hoping for 2024, I will have a very laid back summer with few calls and complaints about caterpillars falling from trees and frass getting in people's hair. But somehow I think I'll still get plenty of concerned citizens, which is fine. That's what we're here to provide the information and put them at ease. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of resources available. This is the first bullet here is our main website, and I'm just going to slide this over and hope that you guys can see this as well. We have a lot of info on this webpage here. There's our story map for 2023 just came out, and that has some interactive features you can get to and look at some of the aerial survey damage and other ground surveys and things like that. But the really cool thing, if you go on this remote sensing link, I already loaded it here just in case. Karen Hutton is our remote sensing program manager, and she's been working on using satellite imagery to really map the change that these outbreaks have been having on the forest, and basically looking at the change in the color reflections. And so this is taking a minute to load, but it'll get here eventually. If you go to this link, which I can drop in the chat when we're done here, it will take you to this map in ArcGIS. And you first have to read these bullet points and agree, because this is not, this is all done through satellite imagery and using software. So there's a lot of caveats to using this. It's a change detection. So that does not mean it is a definitive, this is all insect damage. It could be something like a landslide. There could have been a clear cut, but any major change is what this is picking up. And it's pretty neat. Once you've agreed to all the caveats here, you hit OK. And then you can look at the different areas. And as I mentioned, like here outside Angoon, this was one of the first places we flew over. And I mean, it is just as red as could be because of all the amount of trees that were killed there. And then you can kind of zoom in and zoom around and look at the different change. It has this neat slide thing, so you can look at the imagery without the pixels there. Really kind of cool stuff just to look at from a different vantage point. And this last summer, we went and checked out some of these, the maps and the pixels to see how well it lined up. And this was an area over by Huna. And so it was marked as a moderate amount of change in the orange here. And you can see there's quite a bit of top kill and several dead trees as well. So really, in a lot of places, it works out perfect. You just have to realize that it's not all been ground truth, and some of this could be changed from something else entirely. So moving forward, we have a lot of fun work. Kellen Nelson is in the audience there, and he can tell you more about some of the exciting projects we have going. Kellen and I have partnered with a couple of universities to get some grad students out on the ground this summer and collecting the data that we are so interested in. We have someone from University of Washington who's going to be analyzing old growth tree cores in the hopes that we can track these outbreaks over history and see what, how often they really were occurring and where. And then we also have another partnership with University of Nevada, Reno, and have some students that are going to look at some of these longer term impacts. So now that we know we've had this big disturbance event, what is this going to look like, and what are these impacts? And one of the challenges of working in a system where you only have outbreaks every 30, 50 years, and there's not a lot of data to look at, or not a lot of papers to review on those kind of impacts. So now this provides a great opportunity. Kellen also has an awesome postdoc named Mike Howe. He's an ORISE fellow, and he's been working on looking at modeling the landscape and climate trends associated with the outbreak. He's identified basically a climate window, so sort of like the Goldilocks scenario where the budworms like it to be, the perfect temp and moisture and all that. And if it's too warm, you'll see less outbreaks. Too cold, same thing. So pretty interesting stuff, and hoping to get some of that pushed out here soon. But yeah, lots. Now I'm hoping, like I said earlier, the actual insect activity is declined, but there's going to be a lot of data collection and analysis moving forward. So I think that was plenty of time, but if I have time for questions or anything, feel free to hit me up. My email is there if you want to reach out, and Kellen is also in the room, so I know he'll be able to answer anything about our work going forward. That's all I got. And I see a question in the chat, is budworm worse in second growth versus old growth? That's a great question that we get a lot. And it's definitely one we need to investigate further. There's some areas where it seems like it could be worse in the second growth, and then it's worse in some areas where it seems worse in the old growth. I think one of the biggest factors is going to be how much hemlock is in the stand, and if it's more heavy hemlock, then that's definitely going to influence how much worse the outbreak was. But yeah, there's a lot of those questions we really just don't have enough data or analysis on it to really give a solid answer. But I've seen it look bad in both areas.
All right, maybe one question in the audience.
Oh, I was just gonna ask when the last outbreaks were. Do you
Yeah,
recall when outbreaks were?
so we've had several outbreaks in the more recent years that were more minor or isolated. There was one in the 90s. There was a real brief blip up in Prince William Sound in the 2000s, or yeah. And then, but really as far as the magnitude that we've been seeing this year, or in this current outbreak event, it really hasn't been anything like this since really the 1950s, 1960s. And that was, from all the reports, it sounds like it was a very similar magnitude. One of the reports said every forested acre on the Tongass was impacted. Now, I don't think they surveyed every forested acre, but I'm sure it felt that way. So it sounds very similar to what we were experiencing here recently.
Thanks.
All right, well, thank you very much, Liz. And